All right, so we're going to be in Job. We're going through Job. We're talking about basically a subject that, as Brother Shannon said Sunday, that Christians as a whole don't want to talk about. Suffering. Pain. Pain and suffering. Okay? Now, some of us in here have been through events that we could describe as pain and suffering. Some of us think we've been through events that could be described as pain and suffering. All right?
There's those are going to go through some pain and suffering. Like when Alabama lost the national championship. Don't even start, okay? That must have been painful. Just don't even start.
So yeah, and some of us are the cause of pain and suffering in others, okay? So, now, Job, of course, we understand what Job's been going through. And Job has 3, quote, friends who've showed up to, quote, comfort him. And so they've been having this debate. What's really happening is they're talking past one another. What they're doing is they're speaking from their ideological positions. In other words, well, the only reason this happens is because you've done some really bad sin. And Job is basically saying, I hadn't sinned, I'm innocent in all of this. And Job's friends aren't really listening to what Job is saying, and Job is really not listening to what they're saying. Okay, he basically says, y'all don't understand, let me try to explain it to you. And then his friends are like, you don't understand, let me try to explain it to you. One of the key comforts, if you've ever helped somebody through some trial, some trouble in their life, one of the key comforts anyone has is to be able to talk to somebody without judgment. Now, while listening is something that we're all challenged to do, okay? In other words, we tend not to listen well, right? We what? I'm sorry? What'd you say? We tend not to listen well. Like I'm sure some of y'all had, my dad used to say all the time, some of y'all had fathers, grandfathers, mothers, somebody in your family used to tell you, I'm sure, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth so you could listen twice as much as you talk. No,
I was going to ask something.
Go ahead.
No, are you not being recorded tonight?
I am being recorded.
That's why your pocket's beeping.
Is my pocket beeping?
I kept looking at it. I was like, why is it blinking?
Oh, it's blinking. Yeah, that's why it's blinking.
I'm natural blonde. I'm easily distracted.
Okay, so, yeah, where was I?
We'll get out of Job.
You lost control quick.
I know. Just from the younger crowd this time. So we tend not to listen. We tend to approach every subject from our own position of self-righteousness and judge that situation according to our template. Okay? Y'all are looking at me like a calf at a new gate. Have y'all ever been through?
At the blinking.
Oh, is it the blinking? The blinking's really bothering you?
Smaller words.
There.
Did you hear me?
What?
No. Use smaller words.
Okay, so we tend to think that we're right and our perspective is right and it's the only one that can be right, and so we tend to walk into someone else's trouble and judge them according to what we think is right. Got it? Are we better now? Okay. Do I have to? I'm going to start handing out vocabulary words every. Yeah. Here's our study guide. Okay. So we do that, and so what we really need to learn to do, and one of the things Job's 3 friends haven't been doing well, is just listen. Okay. I'm going to tell you what I'm going through. And it's caused me to be angry, and it's caused me to be bitter, and I want to just get all of this out, and I'm just going to pour it out. It takes a special person to receive all of that and not judge, and not say, well, now, you can't be that way. Well, no, I am that way. I'm feeling this. And so they're just looking for somebody to pour their heart out to. Let me tell you how I'm feeling, all right? You'll notice that not once so far as we've gone through the book of Job has anyone offered to pray for Job. Nobody's offered to, hey, Job, let's take this to God. Let's ask God what's going on. Let's pray for you to get some relief. Okay, you're obviously suffering here. Let's not be concerned with what sin you've committed and how you're hiding it. Let's pray for some peace and for God to reveal His purpose in your life. So, show of hands, who's qualified? She goes, oh, look, I got two. Who's qualified to be a judge in moral issues? Excellent answers. Okay? Because that's what Jesus' whole point was when they brought him the woman. Remember the adulterous woman? And they threw her at his feet. And they said, we caught this woman in the very act of adultery. And the law says, stone her. What do you say? Right? So, Jesus basically told him, right? Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And then he wrote something in the dirt. And everybody's talked about for years and years and years. What did he write in the dirt? I think he wrote a question in the dirt. Or maybe he wrote the answer to the question. If the woman was caught in the very act of adultery, where was the other partner? I think maybe he wrote, where's the man? You drugged a woman out here because she's poor and weaker. The man might be fighting back a little bit, right? He might resist a little, being drug out into the street. So you drugged this poor woman out here, or you didn't drag him out here because he was one of you. Now, I had a Jewish friend once. We were telling that story, and about Jesus said, let he who is without the sin cast the first stone. And just as serious he could be, he raised his hand. He said, well, why couldn't they have all thrown him at once? I said, that's not the point. The point was not who was going to be first, right? That if we all throw them at the same time, right? It's not no, that's not the point. The point is, we're not a good judge of sin. We aren't. How Paul taught us, how do we know sin? This is a chance for you to leave.
Paul said, I would have not known the sin but by the law.
Okay. We learned what sin is because basically God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, the law. That's how we learned what sin was. Right? And so we now know what God doesn't like, sin. And so we know what to try to avoid. But you know what? We're covered in it. So it's hard for me to judge one when my own sin clouds my judgment. So in Job now, and this is kind of what's been going on. Job's 3 friends have basically been saying to him all this time, you're going through all of this because you have sinned somewhere. You have committed some horrible act in the dark of night. And you thought it was hidden, and all this is coming upon you because, see, God don't let anybody get away with it. This is justice. And until you acknowledge that it's justice and that you are a sinner, and tell us what it was, by the way, right? Because we all like a good story, right? Then it's just going to get worse and worse on you. And judging by how bad it is, this must have been some sin. Because, right, remember what happened to Job. He lost all of his animals, his herds of cattle, his herds of camels, his herds of donkeys. well, she'll tell Jesus on me if I'm not careful, so I got to be careful. His children, all in one day. And then he lost his health. And I mean, he didn't just get sick. He got sick, right? And so he's sitting in an ash pile throwing dust and ashes on his head, and his three friends, even though they're condemning him, right? When they saw him for the first time, they sat down next to him, they couldn't speak for 7 days. They were just flabbergasted at what they saw. And so they've been telling him, dude, you have got to confess, you got to come clean, only then will God remove the curse from you. All right? And so this is what's been going on over and over. Each one of them have taken a turn and accused Job of sin. And Job, in response to each one of them, has said, you guys completely misunderstand the situation. I'm innocent. God has made a mistake. In fact, not only has God made a mistake, but He's shut the door and won't even allow me an audience. He won't allow me an interview so I can tell Him He's made a mistake. Because if I could get face to face with God and He would listen to me, I could point out where He's made a mistake. All right? And so Job in chapter 12, Job is going to Scooch over, brother. There you go. Don't be bashful.
She's like, I'm free. I got out of children's church.
All right, so now Job is going to respond, and each of his three friends are getting a little more accusatory. They're getting a little more mean-spirited, if you will. And the last one basically said, how long is this guy going to spout before God just squash him like bug? Okay? I got to throw a little color into it, right? Squash him like bug. Okay, so chapter 12, Job replies. Now I'm just going to read 2 verses because chapter 12 is basically more of the same. But Job is beginning to get frustrated. So Job replied, doubtless you are the only people who matter, and wisdom will die with you. Okay? Job is starting to get just a little frustrated. I can hear the sarcasm in this as Job responds to his friends. Now I've got it printed out here in the New International Version because I tried to modernize the English a little bit. Because in the King James, Job's a tough book anyway, and in the King James, Job is really tough. All right? So Job here, he's talking about, he said, doubtless, without a doubt, you people are the mots, right? You're the top of the list. You guys are the one. Everybody's going to listen to you guys. Now he's being sarcastic. You ever had a friend try to tell you something that was so outrageously wrong that, I know anything about Alabama being so outrageously wrong, you just want to turn and look and say, who gave you the market? Who gave you the market on wisdom, right? Who? We got another saying. Have you ever used this or had this used in your presence, right? Who died and made you king? Right? It's the same kind of thing here. Uh-oh. Right? Who died and made you king? Doubtless you are the only people who matter, and wisdom will die with you. You guys must be the smartest people in the world. Y'all have figured this out.
I refuse to answer on
yeah.
Take the Fifth Amendment.
Take the Fifth Amendment. There you go. So he said, wisdom will die with you, but I have a mind as well as you. I am not inferior to you, who does not know all these things. He said, look, you're not telling me something I don't know. Technically, his three friends, while harsh and misapplied, technically, they've been correct. God does punish sin. God does move you into trial and tribulation as punishment. Okay? So understand that while God does not sit in heaven, and Job has accused him of this, God does not sit in heaven spying on you, waiting for that moment when you will succumb to weakness so He can squash you like bug. Okay? That is not the way it works. But sin has, well, the New Testament put it best, right? Sin has a wage. Sin has an end result. The wages of sin are death. Okay? So when we live our lives, all right, so let's look at the 10 Commandments for a minute. One of the 10 Commandments is not to commit adultery. Right? That's one of the 10 Commandments. It gives us a guideline. It's part of the human-to-human relationship commandments. The 10 Commandments are divided in two sections. Relationship to God, relationship to our neighbor. And so,
first and greatest commandment, second commandment like unto the first.
And so we have these two commandments, right? And Jesus boiled these two sections down. The greatest, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, and all thy mind. And the second commandment being, love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else that's written in all the law is written to explain those two concepts. We come to church on Sunday. Why do we honor Sunday or Saturday if you're Jewish? Why do we honor that? Why do we remember the Sabbath day? Why do we worship on that day? Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, and all thy mind. It's a token or sign of love. So why don't we commit adultery? That is, sleeping with someone else's spouse. Right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so you see how that all works together. So we got a commandment not to commit adultery. But we decide in our infinite wisdom, because wisdom will surely die with us, that's not really a commandment. That gives me no benefit. I'm going to do that anyway. And so we sneak off and we sneak in the back door of some house and we're having a fine time and the spouse comes home, right? Grabs a pistol and perforates us with this pistol. Right? So now I've got 4 or 5 holes in me. So now it doesn't kill me, but I go to the hospital and I have to live the rest of my life with intestines that are cut in half and half a liver and all this other stuff, right? Unless it kills me. And if it kills me outright, well then that's trial in and of itself, right? Because now I'm standing in front of God trying to explain, well, yeah, I'm here a little early because, I was ignoring one of your commandments. And so you see, sin puts us into positions where suffering can take advantage of us. Right? And so that's what these guys are arguing, is that God has set out punishment for sin, wages, if you will, end results, if you will. Okay? You've got people who spend their whole life hating other people, and when you meet them, they look like they're all shriveled up and arthritis has got them all beat up like this, and you're like, what is that? The wages of sin. And sitting right next to them, somebody looks exactly the same way, and they've loved everybody all their life. But arthritis has shriveled them up as well, and you can't say, well, that's the wages of sin. There's something else going on there. We don't tend to judge well. And so technically, these guys are right. To get into sin is to invite these kind of problems to yourself. Just because you're having that kind of problem doesn't mean that it is the explicit result of sin. In Job's case, it had nothing to do with that. We learned that in the first chapter of the book. God said, Job is a righteous man. God had nothing against Job, but he was setting precedent. We talked about this in a couple of lessons before. He's setting precedent. Job is making an argument that proves to humanity the need for a Savior, for Messiah. he did tell God, if you were a man like me, you would understand what I'm going through. And God is basically allowing Job to argue his point that I must put a Savior into humanity, a Messiah, who will be able to understand exactly, who will be able to look at them and say, I know what you're going through because I have been there. So we won't look at God and say, there's no possible way you can understand what it's like to be a miserable creature like me. Okay? And so, in this regard, they've been accusing Job, and Job says, look, I know all this. I know how it works. But what they don't understand is that some of our greatest advancements in faith and maturity come from pain and suffering. For those of you who have children, you won't have trouble understanding this. And if you don't have children, I ask you to remember back to when you went through this, but we were all potty trained at one point. Okay? And sometimes that potty training could be very onerous. You will quit messing up your drawers, and you will learn to go in the bathroom like a big boy or a big girl. Right? And so for the child going through it, it's very traumatic in some cases because it's just tough. But yet, it is a trial that spurs growth and maturity, understanding on their part. They come through it and become a better member of society, especially as far as their mothers and fathers are concerned. In verse 13, chapter 13, so I want to keep going here. So he says, he knows all these things they're saying. He said, my eyes have seen all of this. My ears have heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I'm not inferior to you. Don't talk to me like I'm stupid. Right? Has anybody ever been there? Where somebody's talking to him, you're like, what, have I got stupid written on my forehead? Right? Have you ever felt like that? Somebody's talking to you and you're like, man, I know I don't have stupid written up here. Come on. That's what Job is saying. He said, what do you think, I'm stupid? That I don't know what you're telling me? That I don't understand how all this works? But I desire to speak to the Almighty. Now remember, we read this verse out of Hebrews last week, right? That we, because of Jesus Christ, because the Messiah was in the flesh and died for our sins and sits now at the right hand side of God, we now have the right, the privilege to go directly before the Almighty to plead our case, to obtain mercy and grace in time of need, right? And Job is basically saying, I desire to speak to the Almighty. We talked about this. Physically, he cannot. And to argue my case with God. I want to present my side of the story. Job still believes that he is unjustly accused. Okay? Because they are locked into this idea that suffering means sin. If I have suffered, I have sinned. That's not necessarily the case. In this particular case, what God is doing is bringing Job to a deeper level of understanding. And this is the only way to do it. But He's also put Job through all of this because, as I said before, He's making a case for a Savior. God is making the case that this is what needs to happen. Okay? Look at verse 15. This is Job's, even in all this pain and suffering, this bitterness that Job is going through, Job still has this fundamental faith. And this is why, even at the end of the book here, when we get there, sometime in the future, this is why God doesn't throw Job out. Job's had some pretty harsh words to say. And I've said this in a couple of lessons before. You know, don't be afraid when you talk to God to tell God, this is where I'm at. He already knows. He already knows. So you can't go to the, well, I got to be nice when I talk to God. If you're feeling a little put out, tell Him you're feeling a little put out. Now, before you do that, be prepared, because God may show up, because that's what happens here at the end of Job. God shows up, tells Job, oh, you had some harsh things to say to me, so stand up, face me like a man.
Smite me, almighty smiter.
Yeah, smite me, almighty. He says, stand up. He said, stand up, face me like a man. Now this is God speaking.
That last line got me, but I ain't one for blaspheming, okay?
But he says, stand up and face me like a man. I think about this for a minute. God, the Almighty, Creator of the heavens and the earth. And when He shows up to talk to Job, He is not, I squash you like bug. Okay? He says, stand up. Face me. Let's talk this out. Me and you. To me, that is an amazing thing in and of itself. That when God shows up, He's not playing the God card, right? Like, you worthless scum. Now, He's like, no, stand up, Job. Let's have this conversation. He said, I'll ask the questions. You remember what we read last week? Job said, if he asked 1,000, I couldn't answer one. Yeah, well, this is what's going to happen. All right. He says, so I desire to speak to the Almighty, to argue my case with God. Here we go. Though He slay me, yet will I hope in Him. He said, even if He kills me, smite me, O mighty smiter, right? I mean, even if God showed up and just struck Job down, Job said, I am still going to believe that He is a righteous God and there's hope for me. In the midst of all this, he refuses to pin his faith, pin his hope, pin his for lack of a better word, love of deity on anything else. I wonder how he's going to grab that doorknob. So he says, I am in God's boat. I had one of my previous pastors tell me one time, if we go down, he said, if I go down in flames, at least I'm going down with God. It's kind of the same thing as what he's saying here. I started laughing. He looked at me and said, what are you laughing at? I said, well, if you're going with God, how are you going to go down in flames? But the sentiment was, if my life is a disaster and continues to be a disaster, and I hit a brick wall at 90 miles an hour, I will not turn my back on God. I might be a little upset with Him, because Job obviously is, right? Has no cause to be, but he obviously is. He said, but I'm not abandoning my faith in God. Won't do it. Not for any reason. I have watched people who lose a spouse or a child or material things in some cases and watched it destroy their faith. They just I can't go with God anymore. And here Job, at the depth of his suffering, makes this statement. This is why in the first chapter God said Job is a righteous man, mature in all of his ways. Because even in the midst, and he's got some harsh words, but even in the midst of his suffering, he said, if God is going to just keep beating me until I am a bloody mess, I will still call on the name of my God for deliverance. We get upset if our spouse says a harsh word to us. What? You won't cook dinner for me? Why, I'm not speaking to you for a week.
Guess I don't have to cook the rest of the week.
That would be the answer.
Yeah. Well, I don't have to bring home any money either. Meh.
Joint account.
Yeah.
Got him.
All these things can be changed.
2 kids.
So, That's the point. We're keeping score. Right? What did she just do? Everything I said, she upped the ante on.
He's going to call Jesus.
Yeah. Now, I was surprised that didn't come next.
I didn't hear you.
That's right. We up the ante. You're doing something I don't like, I'm upping the ante on you. All right? But here Job says, no, if he beats me to a bloody mess, I'm sticking with God. If I'm going down in flames, I'm going down with God. He's going to be there with me. He says, I will surely defend my ways to his face. Job believes he has a righteous position, and he will be bold. Again, I'm remembering Hebrews here. He's going to be bold in his defense of himself. I don't deserve this. Indeed, this will turn out for my deliverance, for no godless person would dare come before him. He said, the sinner's not going to dare. I dare to come before God because I know I haven't done anything wrong. To come boldly to the throne of grace to obtain mercy in time of need. That's Hebrews. This is where that is based on. Job was saying, I will come boldly before God to defend myself. Now, obviously, that's not going to work. But it's this. See, this is why we needed Jesus. Someone needed to be able to execute Job's plan, to come boldly and defend. That's what Jesus did for us. He marched in, if you read in Revelations, the Lamb having the wounds which killed him, presenting himself before God. This was a bold gesture done on our behalf. He said, listen carefully to what I say. Let my words ring in your ears. Now that I have prepared my case, I know I will be vindicated. Remember, vindicated there, we've seen that word before, to be found blameless or faultless. Basically, to be found innocent. Have you ever wondered, anybody ever been in a courtroom on a jury, or God forbid that you were involved in a case? They won't let you serve on a jury.
I've been in court.
You've been in court. Matter of fact, I met you in court. I was on a jury.
And I laughed.
Okay. So here's the thing. So when a jury comes back, right, and they ask for the verdict, what are the two choices on the verdict?
Guilty and not guilty.
Guilty or not guilty. They don't find you innocent. Isn't that something? They don't find you innocent.
Guilty is the first one that you have to choose from.
Yeah.
Not guilty is the second.
Is the other one. But they don't find you innocent. No one ever, they don't ask you, is this person innocent?
Not guilty don't mean you didn't do it.
It's just there's not enough evidence.
Not guilty means that the prosecution didn't prove their case.
Right.
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
But vindicated means innocent, blameless. So he's saying, I'll prepare my case, and I'm going to argue this just like Perry Mason in front of a judge, and they're going to find me innocent, blameless. I have prepared my case. I will be blameless, okay? He says, can anyone bring charges against me? If so, I will be silent and die. See, he believes that no one has accused him because there is nothing to accuse. Only grant me... Now, well, let me back up here a minute. So, when Job is talking about all this, he invokes a courtroom, right? And so he's kind of comparing or kind of alluding that he is on an equal with God. And so Job, by virtue of his suffering here, he's hurting so much and having to defend himself to his three friends, Job is beginning to get a little arrogant. And we'll see this is what motivates our last speaker when we get to him, is Job starts to get a little arrogant here. Now, what we're seeing is Job isn't perfect. God never called him perfect as in he was flawless. He called him perfect as in he was mature. Right? We had that discussion when we started this. He says, Only grant me these two things, God, and then I will not hide from you. Withdraw your hand far from me and stop frightening me with your terrors, and then summon me and I will answer, or let me speak and you reply to me. And the question he asks is, how many wrongs and sins have I committed? He basically tells God, it's not a fair fight or not a fair argument for you to keep me under your thumb, to keep pressing me, to keep me off balance. Okay? He said, so if you want to face me, let me up. Right? What is the first thing, somebody comes in and sucker punches you and you're rolling around on the floor and they're kicking you and you say, hey, quit kicking me, let me up and fight me like a man, right? Face to face. This is what Job is asking. He said, let me up, let me catch my breath, and then face me like a man. Now I'll take you. I'll convince you. Now, again, I was talking a minute ago about his arrogance, right? This begins to get a little arrogant. But Job is that confident in two things: his innocence and God's benevolence. He feels like if I could just get in front of God and make this argument, God would see my point of view. Right? He would see it my way. So it's a little bit the pain speaking, but still he says how many wrongs and sins have I committed? Show me my offense and my sin. So he's asking God to justify his actions. You prove why I deserve this. Right? So Job is continuing to get more and more angry. I used the word arrogance a little bit ago. He's continuing to make his challenges to God more and more hostily, I guess you could say. Mortals, I'm in chapter 14 now. I want to go to verse 1 of chapter 14. Again, I'm kind of skipping through these chapters because a lot of it is the same kind of thing. Okay, it's Elihu says it, or Eliphaz says it in chapter 1. Zophar says it again. Job he's answering the same charges over and over again. So it's a little bit of saying the same things. But chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, Job makes this comment: mortals born of woman are of few days and full of trouble. They spring up like flowers. They wither away like fleeting shadows. They do not endure. Basically, Job says here, my disadvantage is God can outweight me. God can outlast me. I'm not going to live forever. Eventually, I'm going to die. Even if I don't die from this particular problem, eventually, I'm just not going to, something's going to get me. Right? I just won't last very long. He says, in chapter 15 now, I want to go ahead and skip on down to chapter 15. Eliphaz, the Temanite, replies. And now Eliphaz is going to begin speaking again. Now, Eli, he was our first speaker. They all showed up and Job made his, oh, woe is me speech, right? And Eli, he said, well, I'm gonna, Job, we need to be a little careful. Eli was very diplomatic in his first speech. And he's like, he tried to ease into it. Job, there's always a reason for these things. Try to be very diplomatic, try to be very gentle. But now he's heard Job arguing back and forth with the other two guys. And so Eli has made a judgment here. He's decided that Job is, he said, I think I've got your number now, buddy. I said, I've been listening to you, and you've told me a lot. I'm an older man than you, and we'll see that here in a few minutes. I'm an older man than you, and I've been around the block a time or two more than you, and so I think I've got your number now. And so he says, Eliphaz the Temanite replies. He said, would a wise person answer with empty notions or fill their belly with the hot east wind? Now, remember in his first speech, like I said, he was very diplomatic. He kind of was being very gentle. But now the gloves are off. He's going right for the jugular here. He's gonna hit Job hard. And so he basically questions Job's intelligence. Job was one of the wise men. Okay, he was well respected. And so Eli says, Job, for a wise man, you're basically making an empty argument. The hot east wind is a reference to the breezes off the desert. Have anybody ever, I was going to ask a silly question, right? Anybody ever been outside working in the heat all day, hours and hours and hours? I knew it was a silly question. When you get home, the heat just drags it out of you. There's a fatigue. There's a fatigue from working hard, but from working hard in the heat, right? You guys work in these plants and you get out in that heat, especially if the process that you're working in that plant is hot to begin with, and that heat just takes it out of you. Just takes it out of you, right? And so he says, would a wise person answer with empty notions or fill their belly with hot east wind? In other words, Job's arguments are just... Basically, he's saying, Job, you're just making me tired, man. Listening to you go on and on and on and on and on and on. Yeah, it's just driving me nuts. You're just making me tired. He said, would they argue with useless words, with speeches that have no value? He basically accuses Job. He said, you're just talking in circles. You're just talking in circles. You're giving me platitudes, cliches. You're not giving me anything that would, in Eli's perspective here, instruct me or tell me that you're sorry you've done something wrong. You're busy throwing up this big smoke screen. There's nothing there. He said, but you even undermine piety and hinder devotion to God. He said, not only are you just being silly, right? You got nothing to say. There's a movie, right, where they get caught, the villain gets caught red-handed, and they ask him for an explanation, and his explanation is, what it was, and this is what he's accusing Job of. He said, you're talking, but you're not making any sense. There's no point to your arguments. And he says, you have even gone as far to undermine piety here. He said, you're reducing or cheapening faith. Basically, you're undermining religion. You're making it so nobody will want to believe in God anymore with your argument. Because remember, what is Job arguing? Job is arguing that God has just, on a whim, decided to lay all this on him. God, without any reason at all, is afflicting him, is making him sick like this, is taking everything away. And not only that, he's accusing God of having done all of this and then not showing up to explain why. And so if all that is true, if Job's arguments are true, he said, well, you're undermining religion. Nobody's going to want to come to church and believe in a God like you're proposing. Right? So this is pretty bold. He says, you hinder devotion to God. You're pulling down, and devotion here, if piety is more of a public a relationship with God, and devotion is has more of a connotation of private. So private prayer and meditation. He said, you're even pulling down the tenets of having a personal relationship with God. Right? That's what we say all the time here. Right? I tell people this all the time. I don't care really where you go to church as long as they're preaching Jesus Christ and the cross and the blood and all that. But what really is important is that you have a personal relationship. When you're not here, you're still with God. That you don't come here to be with God, you come here to be with other believers and worship God, but when you leave, God goes with you. Gets in the car, goes home with you. A personal relationship. Right? The only time you're ever thinking about God is for the scant few minutes that you're in here. And let's face it, if you're listening to the sermon, you're listening to what's being said, you're not really meditating or pondering on God. If that's the only time you're getting exposure to God, you're starving to death. You've got to get some more out there. And here, Eliphaz is accusing Job. He says, you're ruining it for everybody. He says, your own mouth condemns you, not mine. Your own lips testify against you. Look in, for those of you who got your Bibles with you, flip over to Luke chapter 6. I want to read y'all something. Luke chapter 6, we'll start in verse 44. Now, again, I keep saying these guys have valid points, but they're misapplying them. He says here in verse 44, Jesus is speaking, for every tree is known by his own fruit, for of thorns men do not gather figs, nor of bramble bush gather they grapes. He said, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth that which is good. An evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth that which is evil. For of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. He said, a good man, well, he starts off, he gives us a universal example. He says, you don't go to a thorn tree or a thorn bush to look for figs. Right? 644. Where I started. 44, 45 is what I read. So you don't go to let me just put it this way. You don't go to a rose bush to look for figs. Right? And you don't go to a fig tree looking for roses. If you want a rose, where do you go? You go to a rose bush. Or for some of us city folks, you might go to a florist. Because you don't know what a rose bush looks like. All right? If you want an apple, you don't go looking in a pine tree. Right? Because you can climb all the way up to the top of that and get really disappointed. Because there's no apples up there. It's just pine cones. And I don't care what Yule Gibbons say. I know y'all don't know who that is. But I'm not going to be eating a pine cone. He used to have a commercial. Said some parts of a pine tree are edible. And then he was pitching some cereal. Yule Gibbons. Now, it's weird the things I think of, right? And so it's likewise, a good man will produce good things in his life. And an evil man will do evil things in his life. Whatever's in here is what's going to drive the public persona. Okay? You can, and this is what Eli's saying, and this is a true thing. But you see, they're judging Job out of his anguish, out of his pain, out of his suffering, and not from what was going on before. He said, I can tell by what you're saying what's in your heart. Right? That's what he was saying back in Job when he said, your own mouth condemns you. You don't have to listen long for people to tell you who they really are, but you do have to listen. Now, Eli is not truly listening, but he thinks he is. See, James would tell us what? James would tell us that your faith drives who you are. Show me your faith, I'll see your works. Show me your works, I'll see your faith. I can tell what you believe by what you do. I can look at your life and see if you're going to church every Sunday, every Wednesday, what can I tell about you? Well, you're a churchgoer. Well, churchgoers don't go to church because they're getting money. They go to church because of a deeper spiritual reason. Right? And so, back in chapter 15, Eli's telling Job, look, I've been listening to you rant and rave, and I have made a judgment. But he has made this judgment based on a very small window of exposure to Job, and that is in extreme conditions. It would be like me showing up at your house at the very moment you and your wife or you and your husband are having a knockdown, drag-out fight and walking in and saying, well, you two must hate each other because I've been listening at the keyhole. Right? And you're going, well, no, we don't hate each other. We're just having a little disagreement right now. If you'd have been here last night, you'd have seen a whole different picture. I bought her flowers, and she made me a candlelight dinner. We was dancing in the kitchen to the Willie Nelson, and it's very romantic. Except him. Okay, well, who do you want?
Hank Williams.
Hank Williams. Okay, so we're dancing in the kitchen to Hank Williams.
Not Junior.
No. Hey, good looking. What you got cooking? That's a good kitchen dance song. Things I have to go through, right? And he said, so Eli's only been listening to a little piece of Job in his suffering. He hadn't listened to him for long enough to know what's really going on. He says, your own lips testify against you. Are you the first man ever born? He said, what are you, Adam? He uses the word first man. The Hebrew word here is Adam. He said, are you Adam? Were you born before Adam? Were you brought forth before the hills? Flip over to Proverbs 8:25 for me real quick. Proverbs chapter 8. Man, I might just make it. Okay, Proverbs chapter 8, verse 25. In chapter 8, let me back up for y'all for just a minute. In chapter 8, wisdom is speaking. Okay? Wisdom is speaking. If you look at verse 1, it sets the tone. Doth not wisdom cry, and understanding put forth her voice? And as you come down through here, you will see verse 12. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence and find out knowledge. And as you go down through here, verse 15, by me kings reign and princes decree. Okay, so wisdom is actually speaking. The writer in this proverb has personified wisdom, made wisdom as if it were a person who would speak to you and give you advice. Okay? And so in verse 25, look what it says. Before the mountains were settled and before the hills was, I brought forth. Wisdom is saying, I was here before the mountains, before the hills. Wisdom existed before creation. And Eli says to Job, he says, were you brought forth before the hills? It's a direct reference to this notion of wisdom. He said, Job, you're not old enough to be wise enough to make the accusations you're making. That's what he's saying there, okay? Wisdom was made before the hills, not you. You're not that smart. You can't stand and talk with God. He said, what do you know? Wait a minute, did you listen? I'm sorry, verse 8. Back in chapter 15, Job, verse 8. 8. Yeah. Because verse 7 was where you brought forth before the hills. So do you listen in on God's counsel? He said, how smart are you? Hey, you got to hear. Does God let you listen in when He's discussing problems of the universe? He said, do you have a monopoly on wisdom? Okay, so basically He's coming back at Job. Job said, what? Wisdom will die with you all. And so He's turned it right back around on Job. He said, what? You got a monopoly on wisdom? Are you the only wise man in the world? What do you know that we don't know? Well, I can tell you the answer to that question, though they don't know it yet. And the answer to that question is God. It should have been, who do you know that we don't know? Because Job knows God. Because God's going to prove that in a few minutes. Well, next week when we get there. He said, what insights do you have that we do not have? The gray-haired and the aged are on our side, men even older than your father. So what Eli is saying here basically is, he said, we were taught by men who are older than your father. We have wisdom from the ages handed down. This is the way it works. We're the ones who know how it works. Okay? So, and Eli can get away with saying this to Job because it is believed that Eli was older than Job. And so he's basically playing the, I've been around a lot longer than you have. Anybody ever told you that? Just listen to me. I've been around the block a time or two. Right? Not my first rodeo. And God's consolation, he says, the gray-haired aged are on our side, men even older than your father. Are God's consolations not enough for you? The fact that God pays any attention to you at all ought to be enough. God has treated you well in the past. That ought to be enough. Let's see. Words spoken gently to you. Why has your heart carried away? Why do your eyes flash? You shouldn't be angry with God. You shouldn't be angry at all. But Job is angry. Job is at least being honest. He's upset about it. Now, again, I caution you, if you want to go be angry in the presence of God, you can do that. God is not afraid of you. He's not intimidated by you. But just be ready when He shows up and knocks at the door and says, step out here and face me like a man and let's have us an adult conversation. But I'll guarantee you the only conversation that you'll be able to have with God if He shows up like that is with His toenails. Because you'll be on your face. And God won't have to say a word. Okay, so he says, so that you vent your rage against God and pour out such words from your mouth. What are mortals that they could be pure? Of those born of women that they could be righteous? Now this is a true statement. We, as we are born, cannot be pure. We are definitely not righteous. But we, as we are born again, right? We are made pure and we are righteous. This is the part that the three friends are missing, is the compassion of God. It's the part that Job has been missing. The compassion of God. Verse 16, let me get through. I want to read 5 verses out of chapter 16, and then we will be ready to go to chapter 32 next week. So then Job replied, I have heard many things like these. He said, I've been listening to this kind of thinking all my life. You are miserable comforters, all of you. Job has had enough. He has had enough. He said, you guys are not very good friends. I am not comforted by what you say. You haven't helped me at all. All they've done is tear Job down. They've accused him of things he didn't do, that he knows he didn't do. And he says, you're miserable comforters, all of you. Will your long-winded speeches never end? Can't you just shut up? Leave me alone? Yak, 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 yak. He said, what ails you that you keep on arguing? I like that. What ails you? Right? What is wrong with you that you keep arguing? Anybody ever tell you you're beating a dead horse? I've been accused of that. Many times, in fact. I thought it was my favorite hobby. He said, if I also could speak like you, if you were in my place, I could make fine speeches against you and shake my head at you. He said, I could do what you're doing. It's easy to do what you're doing. It's easy to sit in judgment, isn't it? It's easy to look at somebody else whose life you really don't know a thing about and say, well, if they were righteous, yeah, I know they come to church, but I don't think their heart's really in it. Did you hear that? They was back there whispering and all that through service last week. Oh my gosh. We don't know a thing about you. We're ready to cast judgment. That's what Job says. You don't know anything about me. He said, but my mouth, he said, if I were in your place and you were in my place, I would encourage you. I would comfort you with my words. I would bring you relief. He said, I wouldn't be like this. You're miserable, all of you. Worthless as friends. I could do this better than you, basically is what he's saying. Through the next several chapters, from 16 to 31, we get just basically this template. The things we talk, they're going back and forth and back and forth. Right toward the end, Job begins to actually start to name off things he has not done. All right, so if you want to go through and kind of read through those, Job basically says, look, I haven't done sensual or sexual sins. I'm not taking the cleaning lady out around the back. I'm not slipping into town for, a high time with the street prostitutes. I'm not doing any of that. He says, I don't abuse my power. Job had been a very rich man, very powerful man. He said, I don't use that to take advantage of people. Okay? I'm not doing all of that. He said, even though he was very wealthy before all this happened, he said, I didn't trust in my money. His trust was in God.
He wasn't a politician.
Yeah, he wasn't a politician. He said, I didn't even hate my enemies. And we'll see this next week, but in the last part of chapter 31, he says, I was even a good conservative, a conservationist. When I broke the land up and farmed, I didn't do things that were harmful to the land. So I took care of the little piece of earth that God gave me. I haven't broken any of these laws or rules. Okay? And so he goes on this little rant, and he names off all these things that he has not done. Has not done. All right, so next week, though, we're going to get to Elihu, which is Eli the younger, we'll call him. He's a younger man than all of the people who have been speaking so far. And in chapter 32, which is where we'll be next week, he's had enough. He's been sitting around listening to this back and forth between these guys, and he basically is fed up because ain't nobody solving anything. And that's kind of the way it goes, even in today's society, right? The youngers, the millennials, they want to see action. Millennials.
It's like synonym.
Yeah, like synonym. Never mind. So they want to see action. They don't want just empty words. They want to see action put to faith. Right? That's what this guy is. It's not unique to those guys. Yeah, it's not unique to them. Elihu was a millennial. Okay, he wanted to see actions to faith, and we're going to get into. He basically begins to speak, and he gets so wound up and so in the spirit, God's going to show up in the middle of his speech and start talking. So that'll be quite the sight. Okay, so that gets us all the way to chapter 32. Woohoo!